The mandolin fretboard is pretty small, right? But it's still somehow easy to get lost, especially as you keep going further up the neck. One of the best ways that you can feel more confident in your fretboard navigation is by learning the note names for every single fret up and down the neck. By doing this, you'll automatically see an improvement in your understanding and your proficiency of things like scales and chord shapes, improvising, transposing songs, and the list goes on and on. I know it's a pretty massive undertaking learning all these notes, so I want to break things down for you in this video. I'm going to give you a 7-step process that'll take you from 0 to 60 and be your comprehensive guide on how to do this. We're going to start on the ground level with some basic concepts and theory, and we're going to take you all the way to the stratosphere to play on the 20th fret of the mandolin, if your mandolin even goes that high. First, if you don't mind, hit like on this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Also, I've got nearly a book's worth of PDF handouts to go with this video that include fretboard diagrams, standard notation, tablature, and all sorts of other mandolin goodies over on my Patreon site. You can find out more at the link above here. I love to connect with you there. So, step 1. We're not going to be taking a look at any particular scales in this video, but we do need a rudimentary knowledge of how the chromatic scale works. And basically, we're going to be talking about the musical alphabet here to start with. Even if you've been playing music for a long time, don't skip ahead because we want to make sure that we're all on the same page with the terms and the theory of how all this works. First off, as you probably know, there's a repeating sequence of 7 different letters in the musical alphabet. Here are all those letters played on our A string. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and A again. Don't worry about memorizing these just yet. We're just getting used to the mechanics of how things work right now. So these blank letter names without any alterations are called natural notes. Notice how all the natural notes occur 2 frets apart except for B and C and E and F, which happen on consecutive frets. Now don't ask me why this happens, this is just the way things were decided at the dawn of time, and this is a really important thing to remember moving forward. Another important distinction is that as you go up the alphabet, you go up in pitch, which means you're going up the neck or up onto higher sounding strings, and as you go down the alphabet, you're descending in pitch, which means you're going further back down the neck and onto lower sounding strings. And just a little sidebar here, a note about the directions that we talk about on the mandolin. This is up the neck, this is down the neck. These strings are higher and these strings are lower. And that may seem totally backwards to how you would think about it first, but you have to realize that the directions are always talking about the corresponding pitch register. So it's not talking necessarily about the physicality of the instrument, but how low or how high the notes you're playing are. So back on target here, there are 7 different letters, right? But there are 12 different notes altogether to create this chromatic scale that I talked about earlier. And that's all there is, really. There's just 12 different notes in all of Western music as we know it, which is pretty crazy. So these 5 extra notes come from making alterations to the original letter names by adding what we call accidentals, which are either sharps or flats. You can make a natural note sharp by moving that note up 1 fret, or you can make a natural note flat by moving it back down 1 fret. But the challenge is that these accidental notes can be spelled differently depending on your starting place, right? So B flat is 1 fret lower than B, but you could also think about it as A sharp since it's 1 fret higher than A. Or another instance would be G sharp, which is 1 fret higher than G natural, which could also be thought as A flat, which is 1 fret lower than A natural. We're usually only dealing in all sharps or all flats depending on what key we're in. You don't usually see them together. However, there are more common spellings than others on our instrument. Here's the chromatic scale on our A string, covering all the frets from A to A with the most common spellings that we see on the mandolin. And last point here, these notes repeat in sequence in different octaves up and down the neck on every string. Here is the same chromatic scale starting and ending on A in a lower octave. The same notes, but these notes are happening in a different register. Next, we have to see how this musical alphabet works on our particular instrument. If If you're like me and you're ever forced to take piano lessons at some point in your life, you became intimately familiar with middle C. I always had to find middle C first as a reference point to count up or down to other notes. Unfortunately, the mandolin isn't laid out the same way. Instead of one starting place, we have 4 different starting places that overlap. Those starting places are our open strings: G, D, A, and E. And these are the first notes on the mandolin that you should commit to memory, because you can always start here and count up to other notes. So the note up from G would be G sharp, and then the next note up would be A, and the next note up would be B flat, and so on and so forth. But the tricky part is that these starting places overlap as you go further up the neck. So as you walk up your G string, you get to the 7th fret, which is the exact same note as your open D string. So anything that happens above the 7th fret on the G string also happens on your D string. And way up on the 14th fret of the G string is an A note, which happens to be the same pitch as your open A string. So above the 14th fret on the G is the same as what happens on your A string. This pattern continues for all the other strings. 7th fret on the D string is the same as your open A. 14th fret on the D string is the same as your open E. 7th fret on your A string is the same as your open E. And 14th fret on the A string is the same as the 7th fret on your E string, which is a B note. Mapping out these overlapping starting places is essential to understanding the recurring patterns that happen across the fretboard. So open strings are great, but it gets pretty tiresome if you want to find another note higher up the neck. Like, what if you wanted to find a note on the 11th fret? So the next step is to memorize other helpful starting places to count from, right? And these dotted frets end up being really good visual landmarks that also let you know some cool relationships between the strings. Let's take a look at what notes happen across all the strings at each of these dotted frets. Starting on the E at the 5th fret, here is an A note, an octave higher than the open A string, right? Same idea on the 5th fret of the A string. We've got a D note, and that's an octave higher than our open D string. So 5th fret on the D is a G, 1 octave higher than the open G. And the only one that you have to memorize outright is that tricky little C note that happens on the 5th fret of the G. And that's just because we don't have any other strings to compare it to. Next, we already mentioned this, but the 7th fret is the unison of the next higher string. So starting on your G string, you've got a D note on the 7th fret. That's the same as your open D. On the 7th fret of the D is an A. On the 7th fret of the A is an E. And then the only one that you have to remember outright is that B note that happens on the 7th fret of the E. So let's skip all the way up to the double dot on the 12th fret now, and this one's super easy. The 12th fret is always going to be an octave higher of the same open string. So 12 on G is G, 12 on D is D, 12 on A is A, and 12 on E is E. And lastly, on the 10th and the 15th frets, these are a little bit harder because there's not a same association between the strings like these others have. So you just have to memorize these outright. On the 10th fret, you have F, C, G, and D. And then on the 15th fret, you have B flat, F, C, and G. Once you've memorized all these, it should be a lot easier to find all the notes that happen in between the dotted frets just by using these new reference points as starting places to count from. Some folks might be tempted to stop there, but for these next 4 steps, we're really going to kick things into gear. So with step 4, we're going to learn the natural notes on each individual set of strings. This is an incredibly helpful step because once you know all the natural notes up and down the fretboard, you'll also be able to find all the sharp and flat notes too, right? Remember, all you have to do to make a natural note sharp is move it up 1 fret, and to make it flat, move it down 1 fret. Also, remember earlier how I was saying the natural notes always happen 2 frets apart, except for B and C and E and F. That'll really come into play here. My mandolin starts tapering off around the 18th fret, but all mandolins are different. Some go up to the 20th fret, so you can use the diagrams that I provided to get the full range out of your instrument. Great, so you've come a long way already. Let's just take a break and talk about octaves for a second. And I think it's a lot easier to find notes when you're counting up or down in sequence along the musical alphabet, but when you start jumping around within the sequence, it gets a lot harder. So here are a couple finger spacings and shapes to look for that will make your life a whole lot easier. Let's take C for instance. So if you find a lower sounding C like this one on the 5th fret of the G string, you can find an upper octave with this shape. Just move 2 frets lower and 2 strings higher. And the handy thing is that you can invert this relationship. So if you find a higher sounding C like this one on the 8th fret of your E string, you can find a lower octave of C by moving 2 strings lower and 2 frets higher. There's another helpful octave relationship too. So if you find a lower sounding C again, like this one on the 5th fret of the G, you can find a higher octave by moving 1 string higher and 5 frets higher. You can also invert this one, so on the high sounding C on the 8th fret of your E string, just move 5 frets lower and 1 string lower. Okay, here's another big step. We're going to use these octave relationships to find all the occurrences of a single note across the entire fretboard. Let's do this with our C note. I'll go from left to right on the diagram here for you to follow along. And here's the same with all of our F notes on the fretboard. I'll leave you to figure out the rest on your own, or you can head over to my Patreon page to get the fretboard diagrams for how to find all 12 notes across the fretboard like this. All right, we finally made it to step 7. And for this last step, we don't want to just talk about the notes, we want to be able to play them in time. So I've worked up this exercise that takes advantage of this octave relationship to play each note up the neck around the circle of fourths to play all 12 of these notes. And this exercise is pretty advanced. We're using eighth notes here, which makes it challenging to shift from one note to the next. So if you need to start off playing quarter notes or playing half notes, that's totally cool. All right, well, that's quite a lot of work, isn't it? The handy thing is, these notes don't move around on you once you've memorized them. Do you remember when you first learned that open G chord that we always play now? At first it felt really novel and felt unfamiliar, but now I'm sure it's second nature. And the same is true for all the notes on the fretboard. Once you learn them, they're going to become your best friends. And after taking the time to go through these 7 steps really thoroughly, you should be able to automatically know the corresponding note for any fret on the fretboard. And that's the ultimate goal here. You don't want to waste any time thinking about the note name. You want to have an instant recognition. And that's going to help you make so many connections in every aspect of your playing. That's it for now, but stay in touch here on YouTube and on Patreon for more mandolin videos each week. I'll see you guys soon.